Anybody else find it kind of weird that we're promoting a new series coming up that's not in the book of Acts? It's kind of out of place for us, isn't it? No, we're super excited about Advent. It's going to be so good. So make sure that you are here for all 4 weeks of that, every week of December, culminating on Christmas Eve. So before you ask, December 24th is a Sunday. That's Christmas Eve. Are we going to have a Christmas Eve service that night? The answer is yes, we are. So be sure and be at all of these coming up in December, because it's going to be really good, and bring people to come with you.
What else will Christmas Eve be?
Oh, what else will Christmas? Oh, I'm glad you asked that question, Ian. The reason he asked that question is because Christmas Eve is also our church's 5th birthday. We will officially be 5 years old Christmas Eve this year. So super excited about all of that. So we got some really cool things in store for you coming up at Christmas time. But tonight we are in the book of Acts, chapter 27. And Paul is about to have a shipwreck. Now, how many of you have ever been on a boat in the ocean? I'm not talking about like Ulaga Lake. I'm talking about been on a boat in the ocean. Most of us, okay? I've been on a couple of them, like a giant cruise ship, which is basically a floating island, and you don't even really know that you're on a boat because it doesn't really move. And I've been on some smaller ones as well, but maybe the most notable time I was on a boat in the ocean, several years ago, probably 10 plus years ago now, we were living in Northwest Arkansas, and we used to go down to Dauphin Island, Gulf Shores, Alabama area with Whitney's family for vacation every year. And her dad and I loved to surf fish. Like, we'd stand out in the surf with our fishing poles and cast it out as far as we could, and we would catch sea trout. We would catch some occasionally some like sea catfish and a handful of different things. But one year we did that, and we got into a group of black tip sharks. So we were catching sharks that were, they're not like, don't think Jaws, right? Think like sharks this big. But they were so much fun to catch because they were only this big, but they fought like they were enormous. And we just had an absolute blast. And so for the whole next year, we're planning, how can we do this again? We want to catch more of these sharks. Well, during that time, we had purchased a little boat. And when I say a little boat, I mean a little boat. We named the boat Gumper because this was, I think it was a 12-foot boat, because that's about the smallest boat they manufacture. It was a V-bottom aluminum boat, had a real tiny outboard motor on the back of it. And the whole time, we'd use that for fishing in Northwest Arkansas, and worked great on Beaver Lake and all that. But we kept thinking, Will and I just kept tossing this idea around, like, I bet there are some bigger sharks just a little bit further out in the ocean than what we can reach from waist deep casting. I bet if we could get that boat out there and just go another 50 to 100 yards out, then we could really catch some big sharks. So that was our plan. So we pulled Gumper from Arkansas to Alabama, and it was the nastiest weather ever, big waves. And we're trying to put this boat out here, and like not at a boat ramp, because that would make too much sense. We picked the boat up, all of us picked the boat up, and we carry the boat across the beach to the water, and we set it down in the water, and we're trying to get it out there. And every time we were waist deep, and we try to get it past the breaks of the wave, and the wave would pick the boat up and toss it over, and we'd capsize, and everything would go back up to the beach. We'd flip it back right up, put everything in it, and take it out again, and try it over and over and over, and we could not get it to work. So we thought if we can just make it past that first big break, that first big wave that caps over, then we're clear, because out past that, it looks really calm. It's just where the waves are breaking. We got to get past that. So I don't remember who came up with the idea. I'm going to say it was your dad, Ian, because we'll just blame him. He's not here. He's like, if we just get you to that wave and then you just gun it, it wasn't a steering column. It was one of the old manual motors you got to hold like this, right? So he's like, Michael, get in the boat and we'll push you out there, and when that wave hits, you just gun it and get us across that wave, and then we'll swim out there and you can pick us up and put it in. Foolproof plan, right? So here we are on this boat, and I'm in the boat. They're outside at pushing, and we get to that wave, and that big wave hits, and the boat goes straight up in the air like this. And my thought is, it's going to flip over, and I'm going to get underneath it, and this motor is still running. Best thing I can come up with, snap decision, I got to put some weight on the front of the boat to get the front of the boat to come back down. So I let go of the motor and I jump straight up in the air to the front of the boat, thinking that will fix it, because my little 140-pound frame at the time is surely going to stop this from happening, right? It doesn't. So I get to the front of the boat just in time for the rest of the boat to catapult me over. And so I come out of the boat and I'm looking down at the rest of the Dunaways standing underneath me trying to hold on to this boat as it completely capsizes. And then all of us, defeated, soaking wet, and embarrassed, drag everything to shore, drain the boat, and load it back on the trailer and continue to surf fish instead. So that has absolutely nothing to do with what Paul experienced. But it was a fun story, right? So that was one of my experiences with a boat on the ocean, and Paul here is on a boat in the ocean that looks a little bit different. I'm going to show you a picture of it here in a minute, but it is helpful for us to understand just how severe waves can be. They are not forgiving. Right? They will destroy whatever is standing in their way relentlessly. They will not stop, and you cannot stop them. You can't force them to stop. And these sailors, all these 276 people that are on this boat, are experiencing that right here. So let's go ahead and read verse 21. We're going to pick up in verse 21, where last time we ended with them realizing that hope was fading for all of them. Luke says we began to lose hope, right? So now here we are, verse 21. Luke says, since we have been without food for a long time, Paul then stood up among them and said, you men should have followed my advice, not to sail from Crete and sustain this damage and loss. Now I urge you, take courage, because there will be no loss of any of your lives, but only of the ship. For last night, an angel of the Lord I belong to, the God I belong to and serve, stood by me and said, don't be afraid, Paul. It's necessary for you to appear before Caesar. And indeed, God has graciously given you all those who are sailing with you. So take courage, men, because I believe God that it will be just the way that he told me. But we have to run aground on some island. And when the 14th night came, we were drifting in the Adriatic Sea, and about midnight the sailors thought they were approaching land. They took soundings and found it to be 120 feet deep. When they had sailed a little further and sounded again, they found it to be 90 feet deep. Then, fearing that we might run aground on the rocks, they dropped 4 anchors from the stern and prayed for daylight to come. Some of the sailors tried to escape from the ship. They had let down the skiff into the sea, pretending that they were going to put out anchors from the bow. Paul said to the centurion and the soldiers, unless these men stay in the ship, you cannot be saved. Then the soldier cut the ropes holding the skiff and let it drop away. So, verse 21, the point of this whole passage, you should listen to your pastor. End of story. We can finish the sermon, go home now, right? This is like the one of the most epic I told you so moments in the Bible. Paul is like, I told you guys, you should have listened to me. When I said, let's stay here at Fair Havens, it's a nice little hole in the wall place. But no, you guys had to sail, didn't you? And now look where we are. You should have listened to me. But that wasn't entirely Paul's point. Paul was not just using this as an I told you so moment. He was setting this up to elaborate on something else. But the point of this passage, and I was kind of discouraged by the number as I was kind of looking through some different sermons and things that I've seen some people do on this passage. It was kind of disheartening to see the number of people that took this passage, and you may have heard this preached this way before as well, where they look at this passage and they see this whole shipwreck thing happening, and we turn that into an allegory for ourselves. That God protected Paul. We know Paul lands. He doesn't die in this shipwreck, right? And so in the storms of life, God is going to protect you. God's going to keep you safe, just as he did for Paul. And that's simply not the point that Luke is trying to make. That doesn't fit the context of this sermon. So the point of this passage is not that through the storms of life that God is going to protect you and get you through it safely as he did with Paul. That's kind of a gross misrepresentation of what Luke is trying to communicate. Instead, what Luke is communicating, he is relaying the events that took place that demonstrate God's faithfulness. Right? Because God had made this promise. He had told Paul, here is what you are going to do. And Luke is capturing the events that took place. And yes, there were obviously some bumps on the road along the way. But the point is to illustrate the faithfulness of God to fulfill his purposes and his plans in Paul's life. And so we are making a big mistake if we read this story and we try and insert ourselves into the position of Paul and say that this is a story about Paul and therefore it's also a story about me in that same way. That said, there are some ways that we can read this story and sympathize with it and understand it and relate to it even without misinterpreting the text or without doing bad hermeneutics, which hermeneutics is just a fancy word for the study of understanding, interpreting, and applying the Bible, right? So we can actually look at this passage and identify with a couple of things here. But there's another character in this story that I want us to try and identify with tonight. And he's a minor character. He plays a minor role, but it's almost like there's a subplot happening in this story here. And so this character that we're going to talk about tonight is the centurion. So we encountered the centurion last week, right? When Luke got on this ship, and it said Paul got on this ship with Luke and Aristarchus, and they said that the centurion was very friendly, or he was very acted kindly toward Paul, and let Paul get off at Sidon and go visit his friends. And then Paul is giving him their opinion at Fair Havens, whether they should stay there or not. And so this centurion is playing a role in this whole story, but he plays an important role for us here tonight because there's a couple lessons that I think the centurion learns that are also applicable to us as well. But before we get into that, I do want to show you a picture of that ship. And so here is what that ship looks like. So this was a very common sailing vessel. This was kind of the standard type of ship that the Roman Empire would have used to transport cargo. And what was it, if you were here last week, what was it they were transporting other than the prisoners? Do you guys remember? Tea. No, this was not the Boston Tea Party. They were transporting grain from Egypt. So this was a ship, the whole lower part of that would have been full of bags of grain that were coming up from the fields in Egypt, making its way to Rome. About a third of Rome's grain came from Egypt. So there were a lot of these ships coming up. And then this ship only had 2 oars in the back. You can see one of them in this picture here. They would have one of those on either side, and that was what they used to steer, kind of like a rudder. And then they had the big sails up in the front that the winds would carry them along with. So I want you to picture this when we're talking about this ship and everything that is happening here with this ship. But around midnight, Luke says that some of the crew thought they were approaching land. How would they know that? It's midnight. It's dark outside, right? And they hadn't seen the stars or the sun in 14 days because of this big storm, right? So they used the stars and the sun to navigate. So they had no clue where they're going. They're just going along with the storm, didn't know where they were, but they did think that they were approaching land, right? Most likely it was because they could hear waves crashing on the rocks. So they could probably identify they were somewhere close to some land. So they started taking soundings, and they would take ropes, and they would drop a small anchor and take it all the way down until it hit bottom, and then they would mark where that line is on the surface level of the water with the rope, and then pull that back up, and then they would measure the distance from where that mark was to the anchor, and that's how you would tell how deep you were. So they did that, and they found they were 120 feet deep. And then they did it again, and they were 90 feet deep. And that was enough of a contrast that they're thinking, all right, we are getting close to land. We've got to drop anchors so that we don't run aground. So they dropped 4 anchors off of the sides of this ship. Then some of the people on board tried to escape, right? Some of them acted like, Luke says, they were acting like they were dropping another anchor, but instead they were actually lowering the skiff. And this picture I don't think has the skiff, but the skiff would have been like a little lifeboat attached to the front part of the side of the boat here. And so they're lowering that, and Paul says to them, hey, Mr. Centurion man, if they lower this raft down and they get on this, you're not going to survive it. Which seems like an odd thing to say to the centurion, right? But the fact is, centurion soldiers, the punishment for prisoners escaping was whatever the punishment was that the soldiers were there to protect and transport those prisoners. So whatever punishment that prisoner was about to receive would be transferred to that soldier. Most of these criminals going to Rome were going there to be put into the gladiatorial games. So Paul is telling this centurion, hey, look, if some of these prisoners escape on this lifeboat, you're the one going up against the lions. So they cut the ropes and let the lifeboat go. It's interesting now that after all this time, the centurion starts listening to Paul, right? Didn't listen to him 14 days ago when Paul was saying, don't do this or we're all going to die. They said, nah, we're going to make it to the next place. We're going to Buc-ee's, right? Remember that illustration from last week? We're not going to stay here. We're going to the next place. But now he listens to him. And this is lesson number 1 that the centurion teaches us and that we can remember and apply for ourselves. That storms will change who you listen to. When life is going well, we are very reluctant to take the advice of anybody, aren't we? Because why would we? Things are going well. We're doing what we need to. We're happy. We're being successful. Everything's going according to plan. We don't need the input from anybody else. We can just continue doing our own thing. However, when the Euroclydon, which was that word we looked at last week, remember they named this storm? This storm was so big it had its own name. The northeaster is how our Bibles translate it. Euroclydon is the Greek word for it. So this is what this storm was called. When those things hit, then everything is up for grabs, right? Then we're looking for something to grab onto. We want advice from somebody. We want somebody to tell us how to fix it. Right? How many times have we been there where we're in a very nasty situation, we don't understand what's going on or how to fix it, we're super anxious about it, the burden of life is just weighing down on us, and we just say, I just want someone to tell me what to do that will fix this whole thing. That's when we want to hear the advice of someone else. And this centurion is kind of experiencing this for himself, right? He didn't want to listen to Paul back in Fairhavens, but now, after 2 weeks of being at sea and not knowing where they are and their very lives are in danger, now in these darkest moments, when this storm hits, it changes our perspective of who it is that we listen to. But and here's kind of one of the points I want us to recognize tonight. When those storms hit, we as believers, who do we typically go to in those moments? Well, we go to another believer, right? We go to someone that we respect and look up to, someone who's mature in the faith and can give us good spiritual guidance, right? They will offer us something. Usually it's a pastor. It's not always a pastor. Doesn't have to be a pastor, nor should it always be. But a lot of times that's who we go to, right? We go to a pastor or somebody that can offer us this sage, godly counsel. But the reality is that if they're offering you that kind of counsel and that they're that kind of person, they're going to offer you that same kind of guidance when the seas are calm as well. And so we need to be listening to that. But it's during these tougher moments when we become much more receptive to the voice of God, isn't it? that it's when life is hard that our ears are most attuned to what it is God wants to say. And I know we all have experienced this ourselves because it's just part of being human, right? That we don't want to listen to something until there's so much pain that we don't have any idea what else to do. So, okay, now we're ready to listen. And to that point, one of my favorite quotes is from A.W. Tozer, who said that it's doubtful whether God will bless someone greatly until he has hurt him deeply. And the rest of that quote says that God actually rises up storms of conflict in relationships at times in order to accomplish a deeper work in our character. It's who we listen to in those moments that will shape or will distort our character. So who is it that you listen to in those difficult times? What are the voices that you allow to speak into your life when things get difficult? When life becomes unbearable, where do you turn? Do you turn to the contents of a bottle? Do you turn to images on a screen? Do you turn to spending or purchasing things? Or do you turn to investing yourself fully into your work? Whatever it is, we all have these different things that we turn to and we put our time and attention to, and those are the things that we want to listen to. But at the end of the day, when we get jolted into an awareness of how dire our situation is, none of those things are going to fix it. Instead, what we ought to be searching for is that godly wisdom from someone who walks closely with the Lord, who has the character and the trust that you can instill in one another to share ideas and advice and guide people through those things together. And that's what the centurion is starting to do here, right? He's starting to listen to Paul. He is at this point now where he's listening to him enough that he just cut the lifeboats and like, okay, they're gone. We don't have another lifeboat. So now what do we do, Paul, right? So let's keep reading and see what he does. Verse 33. When it was about daylight, Paul urged them to all take food, saying, "Today is the 14th day that you have been waiting and going without food, having eaten nothing. So I urge you to take some food, for this is for your survival, since none of you will lose a hair from your head." And after he said these things and had taken some bread, he gave thanks to God in the presence of all of them. And after he broke it, he began to eat. They were all encouraged and took food themselves. In all, there were 276 of us on the ship. And when they had eaten enough, they began to lighten the ship by throwing the grain overboard into the sea. 14 days with no food. That's a long time with no food, right? And why hadn't they eaten in this 14 days? There's several different ideas, and we'll never know which one of them or if it's a combination. But one idea is that they were fasting to whatever God that the various people on the boat believed in, praying for them to spare their lives and to save them, right? So that's one idea, that this was a 14-day fast to keep them safe. Another idea is that they were just too seasick to eat, right? I get seasick very easily, and the thought of being out in the ocean like this, on a boat like that, for 14 days in the middle of this storm, I wouldn't want to touch food. Right? So that could be a part of it. It also could be that because of the movement of the boat and because everything had gotten soaked and waterlogged and all of that they couldn't actually cook or make any of their bread. They just had the raw grain and they couldn't make their bread, so they didn't have a way of eating. Who knows what the actual reason was? And Paul could be speaking literally here, saying you haven't had anything to eat in 14 days. It could be a little more, not rhetorical, but he could have been exaggerating a little bit here and just been like, man, you guys haven't eaten anything. Meaning they've only had very little to eat. In any case, Paul knew that they needed their strength and that if they were going to survive, they weren't going to drown from the shipwreck, but they would starve to death if they didn't eat. So you guys sit down and eat. And Paul leads out by eating first, right? And then after they had all eaten, Luke tells us there's 276 people on board, which if you look at that picture of that boat, I don't want to be crammed on a boat like that with 276 people. That boat's about 120 feet long or so, which is a little less than half of a football field. So it's still a big boat, but that's not a very big boat for almost 300 people, right? But there's that many people on this boat, and they all eat. And when they get done eating, they do something really, really interesting. They begin throwing all the grain overboard. And this takes us to lesson number 2 that the centurion is learning in these storms, is that storms will prove what you value most. The whole point of this ship going to Rome was to deliver cargo, right? It was delivering grain. If they get to Rome and there's no grain on this ship, Rome's not paying for a ship full of grain when there is no grain, right? So this was their livelihood. This was the crew's livelihood. The owner of the ship is on board as well. His business is at stake here. And they are not going to get any paychecks out of this if they throw the grain overboard. But when these storms happen, your priorities become very clear. When it comes down to your life or a paycheck, you're tossing the grain overboard, right? And so that's something that helps us think about the storms that we face is what are our priorities in these storms? Storms serve as a very powerful litmus test for us of our true priorities and our values. They help us strip away all of the non-essential pieces, and they force us to make hard decisions. So a really helpful question for us to ask in this moment is, who is it that you are trusting, or what is it that you are valuing when life gets tough? When life gets hard, when you are going through difficult times, stop for a second and ask yourself, what is it that I am valuing most right now? What am I trying to protect in this moment? And why? Why is that what I'm choosing to protect? So the centurion orders that all the grain be thrown overboard to save their lives, because ultimately he realized that the lives of himself and of his crew and the people on this ship was more valuable than a boatload of grain. So why did they throw all the grain overboard? What was the point of that? Right? How did that help them survive? Well, let's keep reading the rest of this chapter, and we'll see how. When daylight came, they didn't recognize the land, but they did sight a bay with a beach. They planned to run the ship ashore if they could. They cut loose the anchors. They left them in the sea, and at the same time, they loosened the ropes that held the rudders. Then they hoisted the foresail to the wind and headed for the beach. But they struck a sandbar and ran the ship aground. The bow jammed fast and remained immovable, while the stern began to break up by the pounding of the waves. The soldiers' plan was to kill the prisoners so that no one could swim away and escape. But the centurion kept them from carrying out their plan because he wanted to save Paul. So he ordered those who could swim to jump overboard first and get to land, and the rest were to follow, some on planks and some on debris from the ship. And in this way, everyone was safely reach the shore. So daylight comes, they can see shore, so they were right about that. Land is close, they can see shore, but they don't recognize it. They don't see a port that's familiar. Maybe they were kind of hoping to see Phoenix, which was the port that they were trying to get to. They were hoping maybe they just out off the coast spinning circles, and then all of a sudden, oh, look, here we are, we're safe, let's harbor here. Or maybe they were looking for the terrain of Africa to know if they were close to those sandbars that we talked about last week, and trying to get their bearings a little bit, but they didn't recognize where they were. But they did recognize that there was a beach, and a beach meant no rocks. It meant easier ability to swim to shore. And so their plan was to run the ship up as far onto the beach as they could. And so what they did simultaneously, they cut the anchors, which is a dangerous thing to do, right? Because once you cut the anchors, you're not getting those anchors back. They're gone. They're going to cut the anchors. They're going to hoist the sail. They're going to untie the ropes that are holding the oars in place. So they're going to try and give a little bit of direction to the boat. put the sails up, let this storm blow them as fast, because they're lighter now because they threw everything off. So the boat's sitting a little higher in the water, which means they can get closer to the bank. And they are just going to run at full speed. They are going to full send right up this beach and then have just a nice, easy little swim up to the land, right? That's the plan. Now, the place where this happened is now called, on the island of Malta, it's now called St. Paul's Bay. And here is a picture of this. I don't know if this is what you imagined that this place looked like, but this is most likely the same beach that they had in mind here, that Paul or Luke tells us about, that they're somewhere out here and they see this beach. Obviously, it didn't have all the beach umbrellas and things like that you see in this picture, but it would have been terrain exactly like this. And so their plan was to lighten the boat as much as they could and let that storm push them as far and as fast up to this beach as they could get before the sand stopped the bottom of the boat, and then they would just hop out and swim forward. What they did not expect, as things tend to happen, they had a plan, and it immediately fell apart. That seems to be the entire story of this journey so far, right? That they ran into a shoal. So out here off camera somewhere is a big shoal where there's rocks, and it's pretty treacherous right there. And that's what they happened to run into. And the front of their boat gets wedged in between a couple of these shoals, and the storm waves are just thrashing the back end of that boat and destroying it, and the boat's just coming apart. So now the centurion is faced with a decision. What do we do now? We don't have any anchors, so we can't. I mean, we're already shipwrecked. We're stuck. We're not going anywhere. This boat's going down. We don't have a life raft because we cut that. We're running out of options here. So his soldiers decide, let's kill all the prisoners. Seems a little harsh, doesn't it? But again, remember, if these prisoners jumped out and they swam to shore and they escaped, these soldiers would be responsible for their punishment. So it's better to kill these prisoners right now and spare their own lives than to let them risk escaping and them be killed. It was them or us is how they were looking at it, right? Paul was a prisoner. So Paul was one of the ones who was about to be killed. But this centurion did not want that to happen. And so he ordered his troops, stand down. And this is the third lesson in this. The storms will reveal who you truly are. They're going to reveal who you truly are. The measure of a person is going to be determined by difficult situations. If you want to see who a person's character really is, if you want to see what kind of person someone is, watch them, listen to them, observe them in their darkest moments. That's when you're going to see what kind of person that they really are. And for this centurion here, you know, he stopped these soldiers from killing them, but there really was nothing that prevented him from going along with it. There's not a Roman official in the known world at this time that would have held him responsible if he had killed all those prisoners, because that was customary. That's how they would do it in a situation like this. It didn't matter about them. I mean, they were prisoners. They were going to die anyway. Better to save the troops, save the crew, save the business people, save the wealthy on board, kill all the prisoners, and let everybody else live. But this centurion was willing to risk not only his own life and the lives of his troops. He was willing to put all of that out on the line to save an innocent man. He wanted to protect Paul. And I think it's really important to recognize that and to draw attention to that, giving the centurion a little bit of credit here, saying, hey, listen, this guy, he was well within his rights to say, okay, kill all the prisoners and we'll all jump out and swim to shore and find another boat. But he didn't do that. He felt that the innocence of Paul, and presumably after spending a couple of weeks with Paul, and he already was kind to him, that he kind of knew what kind of man Paul was. And he knew that Paul didn't deserve that kind of death. And so he was willing to risk it all. And in those storms, in those moments, we see the kind of character that the centurion has. And I think that's why that Luke paints this centurion only in a positive light in every encounter we see him in. We never see him paint this centurion in a bad light. And I think that's Luke's way of telling us, hey, this was an honorable man. Now, we don't know much about him other than this fact. This is the last time that we hear him mentioned. They're still not to Rome yet. They got all the stuff that's going to happen in chapter 28, what happens on Malta, and then sailing from Malta to Rome. All of that transpires, and we don't hear the mention of the centurion. So the centurion's story ends here, right? Remember I said he's a minor character, and he's got a subplot. His story ends here, but it's very interesting to see the way in which he is, the character that he displays here in the middle of this intense situation. And the fact that maybe willingly, maybe unknowingly, this centurion became an instrument in God's hands for his faithful plan of delivering Paul. Because not only was Paul in danger of drowning in this ship, but he was more immediately in danger of being executed by the soldiers. And the centurion stopped it. And so it's really interesting to see whether the centurion became a believer or whether he wasn't. We don't know. Probably be kind of hard to be stuck at sea for 2 weeks with the Apostle Paul and not become a believer, maybe. But so I kind of lean toward he probably did, but who knows? But at the end of the day, this soldier was used by God to accomplish God's faithful purposes. He could have just gone along with the rest of his troop, but instead, he orders everybody jump in and swim for it. And so some of those of you who can swim, I imagine this was a pretty interesting situation. Okay, how many of you can swim? Raise your hands. All right, jump overboard. Knew I shouldn't have raised my hand, right? Like, if you can swim, jump in and swim. Everybody else, grab onto something that floats and doggy paddle up to the shore, right? And I love how Luke captures this for us. Now, it makes sense that it was, hey, those of you who can swim, jump in. Everybody else grab onto something. And then those of you who can swim, drag those people who are holding on to boards, drag them up to the shore, and let's get everybody safe. But the way Luke tells it, particularly I think in the King James, that they rode boards on waves, you were either swimming or you were surfing. So there you have it. Surfing is biblical, right? It's right here. That's good exegesis. I don't care what Ian says. They were surfing. They got on boards. They rode these boards on the waves up to the beach. And by that measure, everybody was saved. And that's where the shipwreck part comes to an end. But there's more to the story, right? We're on Malta. We're not anywhere near where we need to be. We've still got a lot of voyage left ahead of us, and we've got a couple of very interesting things that are going to take place here on Malta that we'll talk about over the next 2 weeks. But I want us to recognize some of the same lessons that I think this centurion probably learned here as well. And let this be a reminder to us that from God's word, that when these storms happen, and all of us experience storms, right? And we all have things that God has called us to do, and it's oftentimes that whatever it is God has called us to do is very difficult. And it's never going to be easy to do those things. But as we are navigating those difficulties, remember that these storms are going to change who you listen to. They're going to prove what you value most, and they're going to reveal who you truly are. So with that said, I'm going to pray for us, and then we will get into chapter 28 next week. God, we are grateful that you do use storms in our lives to teach us, that they refine us, that the difficulties of life, while they're not desirable, they're not things that any of us want, they are things that shape us and mold us into the people that you want us to be. And to do that, I pray we would listen to those godly voices around us, not only when it's too late or when the storm happens, but when things are going well, would we be wise enough to listen to godly counsel from those you have placed in our lives? And Lord, would you help us and point out to us those things that we most value when we are in difficult situations? Would we see what it is that we are trying to protect? And when life is hard, that's when we recognize whether the things that we're placing value on align with your will or whether they don't. And God, we recognize that it's in those moments of darkness when our true character is most revealed. So Lord, would you help us to be people of good character? Would you help us to be people of godly character? People who love you, people who pursue you, people who chase after you and your will for our lives, no matter whether it is smooth sailing or whether it's a storm. May we chase after you. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.